The year was 1914, a time of great change, war and industrialization. Wildlife and the natural world were fast becoming another casualty. Out of this darkness, a big game hunter, one Major Hesketh Vernon Pritchard, became concerned for the population and plight of grey seals. Their numbers were deemed critically low in British and Irish waters. Rallying friends, colleagues and one Charles Lyell MP to the cause of these harmless and interesting beasts, the groundwork was laid for what would become the world's first legislation protecting a wild species. This was the Grey Seals Protection Act 1914. Driven by popular support, this act passed unopposed into law. This act of humanity, from the overhang of war to this modern age, shines through time, and on this event the world of conservation turned. Lanugo, the birth coat of the grey seal, the most brilliant of nature's whites. Born on the remotest outposts of land, girdling the Atlantic, just above storm surges, the white coats or grey seal pups reflect the wintry light from dark sockets of the shoreline. In remote bays, caves, on beaches and sea stacks, they will lay ashore nursed by attentive mothers, as they have for aeons. These mothers may lose 40% of their body weight, and pups treble in size on what is nature's richest milk over the next 3 weeks. Blubbered up with reservoirs for the months and storms ahead, they take to the ocean and a nomadic life, following fish, divesting their lanugo till recalled one day to their birthing sites. With the rookeries departed, the shoreline falls silent again, save for the sounds of seabirds, surf and storm. Beyond land, we know little yet of their lives.
Working with seals came a little bit by accident, but working with marine mammals was something that I wanted to do for a long time. I think in terms of deciding a career path, and a fairly uncertain career path it would have been at the time. But marine biology or marine science were things that interested me. I kind of grew up, very much involved in the sea and activities around the sea, and it just seemed like a natural path to try and follow from a career perspective. And why seals? Well, I suppose I started out doing some work on cetaceans as well back in University College Cork, and it's very difficult. They're very difficult species to study, and when it comes to actually, when you're trying to qualify and develop projects, things like working on whales and dolphins can be really quite challenging and quite difficult. It can be difficult to get data, but for seals, it's a little more. They're a little more accessible. They have to come into land for various activities and various functions, and because of that, they're a slightly easier species among the marine mammal group to study and to actually collect data, which you're going to need obviously to do a doctorate. So that was really the reason that I was directed towards seals, and the issue that funded the project initially was the issue of seals in fisheries and the impact that grey seals in particular were having on inshore fisheries, and that interaction still continues today. But that project for my PhD was set up by a fisheries working group that was composed of BIM and the Marine Institute, and the Sea Fisheries Boards as well, and National Parks and Wildlife Service. So they were all interested in the issue of seals and fisheries and continue to be interested in it for various reasons, obviously, today. So what you'd have here in the breeding season, basically prior to the breeding season, in July, August, you'll have adults coming and scoping out the terrain here. Now, some of the adults that breed here have been breeding here for generations, and they would be site faithful, so they would return to the site to breed. So you'll have males scoping the territory in order to control it, and then you'll have females who are coming in looking to use that territory in order to have a pup, deliver a pup, and then mate before going back out to sea again. So if you're a fly on the wall and you're sitting on a rock and you're watching one of these breeding beaches, the first thing you'll note probably are males and females starting to swim around into some of these coves that are otherwise abandoned and empty, just in advance, a few weeks in advance of the breeding season. And whatever cues they're using, they're able to recognize particular places and return to those. Even if they're blind in some cases, they can still return to those breeding beaches. So the males will tend to establish themselves either on the shore or in the shallows, or high up on a rock in a prominent position, sort of saying, look, this is me, this is my beat, don't come in here. After that, the females tend to come in. The males will interact with the females and almost in a way get to know who's in their beat. But the females will, pretty soon after that, after some days, the females will actually deliver the pup on the shore in most cases, and then feed the pup for a period of weeks. So you'll see females intermittently either lying and sleeping on the shore alongside the pup or near the pup, or they'll go into the water. Some of them will go and forage. A lot of them will stay relatively close to the shoreline, and then they'll come back in intermittently and feed the pup. In the first few days, the pup does quite a bit of calling to prompt the female to come in. But you tend to see as the pup gets bigger and bigger and fatter from the milk, that you'll see that the pup calls a lot less. And eventually, after a period of 3 or 4 weeks, the pup is really quite big and bloated and has quite a layer of insulating blubber. And at that point, the females will start to wean it off the milk, and the pup becomes more independent. And after about 4 weeks, or a little more than 4 weeks, the pup is on its own in most cases, and they're pretty much abandoned, and they have to find their own way in life. So they're given this big fat store of blubber with which to travel the world, really, and then they're left on their own. And what happens is the female then will mate with the male during the weaning period or just after the weaning period, and then she'll head to sea. We're starting to get a handle on just the basic biology, the basic population ecology of seal populations in Irish waters, whether it's the harbour seal or the grey seal. And so there's a huge amount that we still don't know, particularly related to what they do when they're in the water. Obviously, when they're on land, it's easier to observe, but when they're in the water, technology is expensive, really, to find out the dynamics of what they do, where they go, how they feed, and also understand the variability in that. I think that absolutely law is very important. The fact that they're legally protected does have some weight, obviously, and a key thing, I think, is communicating that to the wider public. Certainly there's a lot of scope for more education about what that means, what legal protection means. But it certainly has been beneficial, and there's plenty of evidence, from the UK and from other countries where marine mammal species have been protected, that in a lot of cases their populations do better, and people have a greater, I suppose, understanding of why they're important. It also helps to spawn more research to try and understand how best to protect them, how best to manage the populations. So the legal aspect is very important, but it's nothing without education. I think education is absolutely critical, and there have obviously been a lot of initiatives in the past, and I think educating young people, particularly, the young people are the future, and if you want species to exist and coexist with humans into the future. You have to work on the children so that their understanding of ecology and of the importance of key predator species, including seals, in the overall biodiversity. So that's carried forward, you know.
Here's my daughter here, Erin, and Erin loves the sea. She lives right on the seashore. She couldn't get any closer to it if she tried. Erin, what kind of things have you seen on the sea?
I've seen seals, crabs, lobsters, lots of different types of fish, and lots of different types of shells.
And what's your favourite thing you've seen?
It would have to be the baby seal.
We bring our school and during the summer down to the beach to do a bit of rock pooling, and we had 80 kids this summer on the beach, and each one of them had found something different, and it was great fun, wasn't it?
Yeah.
Erin really enjoyed her time on the beach with our schoolmates. I just can't believe how from my grandfather's time to right to this modern day that fishermen are going to sea not with one net but with 4 nets, and it's absolutely one of the reasons why I actually got out of the industry was because of this. The fishing grounds haven't changed, but all the methods for catching fish have changed. You're going to sea now with a factory aboard your boat to fish on the same grounds that your grandfather fished on. He didn't go to sea with a factory in his boat. He didn't go to sea with a fridge. He hardly went to sea with oilskins, never mind the fridge. But that's what's happening now, and it's really a shame to see it happening. But another 20 years, maybe they'll have 8 nets going out to sea. That type of fishing cannot be sustainable. There's problems within the industry all the time. They have to have markets for their produce. Some of the markets now are starting to collapse, especially the Spanish ones.
Mr. John, there is a lot of generations for fishing. Will there be a generation for me when I'm fishing?
Well, hopefully there will, yeah. But you'll see fishing differently than what I seen it, and you'll see it differently than what my father seen it and my grandfather seen it. Everything is changing. So we might outfish ourselves. We might get too clever for fish. And who knows, maybe there won't be fish there, I don't know. I can't say yes or no if there's going to be fish there, Erin.
Well, we're standing in a museum that was built in the 1850s, and it's very much still a museum of a museum because it hasn't changed much in almost 100 years. The building was filled by the Royal Dublin Society, who started off this collection of animals, and they spent 50 years from the 1850s through to the early 1900s filling the building with everything they could find around the world, and that was the point, was to have one of everything in nature under the same roof so that you could explain what was going on in nature. Once the building was filled, it has changed very little. So you're looking at a 19th century, early 20th century approach to wildlife. So when they needed another extinct animal, they would put it on the list and they would go looking through the taxidermy books to see who had one for sale, and they'd put the word out for some of those things. So the attitude to wildlife was very different. It was a case of, if something is on the verge of extinction, our job as museum people is to get one of the last ones in to show people what it looks like And of course that will add to the prestige of the museum and possibly the scientist. And 100 years later, the attitude would be totally reversed. Any scientist who set out to get the last of something for anything other than a breeding program would be a pariah, as opposed to a hero in their own scientific community. And it was perhaps just the seals with that very specific challenge that became identified and established as the first individual species to get protection, as opposed to protection in general or the concept of preserving an ecosystem in the whole. Well, I think we've got the advantage that we've got more than 100 years of understanding that we can affect ecosystems and we can cause the collapse of a population. We now have a lot of professional scientists. That's not something that was true in wildlife terms until the mid-19th century. A huge amount of the endeavour was by people who were amateurs. Some of the biggest names in science, like Darwin, were basically amateurs. They had private incomes or they had other jobs, and it was their passion to do wildlife. Most animals do need a champion in this modern world. We need celebrities to come and passionately explain why it's really important to do something in order to affect our behaviour. While people aren't necessarily hunting animals to the edge of extinction, they're happily driving their cars on motorways that have ploughed up big areas of the landscape. And you've got to try to persuade people that they've got to leave a lighter footprint on the earth.
Well, I suppose going back many years, there was a lot of conflict between seals and well, I suppose originally the islanders, people living on the island, they hunted seals, and well, they would have used the seals, the blubber for oil and lamps and things like that. But then after that, there would have been a lot of conflict between the seals, and fishermen thought that they were depleting the fish stocks. And there was quite a few instances where they were, illegally culled and begging in places, and it got a lot of actually international publicity, bad publicity. So in latter years now, they've been protected, and the Blasket Islands are they're an SAC, Special Area Conservation, which is a European designation for grey seals, and the population has basically exploded now. There's a lot of seals there, a lot more than I ever remember over the years when I was fishing around the island. Some people say they're out of proportion, out of balance, but nature has a way of balancing itself, so anything could happen. You could get great white sharks coming along predating on them, you could get killer whales predating on them, you could get a repetition of that virus that was there years ago, herpes or something, that knocked out a lot of seals. So it'll probably all get in balance again, but for the time being it's good to see they've made a total recovery, you'd have to say that. And I suppose from a point of view of people fishing, because I'd have a foot in both camps, I suppose, over the years, a lot of the fishermen would blame them. They definitely do deplete some of the fish stocks, but at the same time there must be a lot of fish there or there wouldn't be so many seals there. So a few things we don't mention on the boat. Used to be politics, religion, now it's economics. So people like to go out in the boat, to get away from it all, and they like to get into nature and to see nature. So people would be a bit disappointed if they go out and they don't see anything. At the same time, we find that people are coming on board with too much expectations. It's a bit like David Attenborough syndrome. They're watching too much telly at home, watching all these fabulous wildlife programs. They don't realise how much work goes into making these programs. There could be weeks and weeks and weeks, team of researchers, and they get that few minutes on the screen, and people come out in the boat and they expect to get that within 5 minutes. But the other extreme is, you need a certain amount of wildlife to show the people, and at the moment we're very lucky here on the Blaskets. It's very, very rich in wildlife and bird life, cetaceans. We get, common dolphins as you saw today, we get minke whales, we get humpback whales, we get basking sharks, we get all the puffins, storm petrels, Manx shearwaters. We had some skuas today, Arctic skuas, sooty shearwaters, migratory birds. So it's a really, really rich resource. And I don't think a lot of Irish people even appreciate it as much as, they get the foreign people coming here, people from Germany and England next door, and they're just blown over by the wildlife here. So it's something that we really need to appreciate more in this country and see it as a resource to be treasured, and also as something that can give employment to local people. And apart from the work that we have on the boat, a bit of employment, people like yourselves, you're staying in the B&B overnight, you're going to have a meal around here someplace, maybe a couple of pints. So it is very evenly spread among the community, that kind of that resource, and it's worth it. As people think it's just the people bringing people out in the tour are making the money out of it, but it's not. There's a much wider base than that in the community.
My name's Andrew Jackson. I'm an environmental lawyer. I have worked in private practice as a lawyer. I then worked for a few years for the UK Government's Department for Environment, advising on nature conservation law. And then I moved over to Ireland in 2007 and did a PhD on the history of European nature law. And I now work as the Natural Environment Officer and in-house lawyer with Antashka, the National Trust, which is a charity and non-governmental organisation. Interestingly, seals have been singled out for special treatment in conservation legislation, alongside birds probably, which have often been given special treatment, in other words having dedicated legislation. So what we saw was a very early piece of conservation legislation in the UK in 1914, the protection of the Grey Seals Protection Act 1914 rather, which was brought into law owing to concerns over dwindling numbers of grey seals in the United Kingdom. They were said at that time to be down to about 500 individuals. Now, since people have said maybe that was an underestimate, nevertheless, the figures I've seen were maybe it was more like 2,000, but that's a tiny number compared to what we see now. And interestingly, it is a conservation success story in the sense of a piece of legislation which intervened and made a difference. And what it did essentially was to provide a closed season when seals could not be killed in the wild during their breeding period. By 1932, the Irish Free State, as it was then, had repealed the 1914 Act because of pressure from fishing interests. And we have to skip then to 1976 to the Wildlife Act in Ireland, which provided some protection for seals. There has been a series of legislative interventions in the UK, and over time a real growth in public opinion in favour of protecting seals and against culling, interestingly. So whatever the legal position, there has been almost a de facto bar on culling in the UK in more recent times, because public opinion is such that pressure is put on politicians to say, no, whatever the law says, whether it's possible to permit a cull, you shouldn't be doing that. It is striking, I think, to look at the changes in population of grey seals in the UK since the 1914 Act, which provided this closed season when seals couldn't be killed and taken during their breeding season. So from a low back then of maybe 500 to say 2,000 or so individuals in the UK, the year-on-year increase since that 1914 Act has been something of the order of 6%. And in 1999, the population was in or around 125,000 individuals, so a huge growth. And no doubt the population has increased again quite a bit since then. In contrast, the most recent figures that we've seen for grey seals released by the National Parks and Wildlife Service are a population estimate of between 5,000 and 7,000 individuals. Now, taking account of the relative sizes of the countries, I still think it's a striking difference in terms of the populations. One might expect there to be a larger population of grey seals. The EU started to, in a modest way at first, make environmental rules, or propose environmental rules for the countries of the EU to adopt. And the first major conservation intervention was the Birds Directive in 1979. It was a bit of a difficult time for nature regulation in Europe. The European Commission's hands were a little bit tied. They had European funding available, but the member states consistently said you can only spend that on birds. So the Commission tried its best to stretch those rules as much as it could, because there were certain critically endangered species in Europe at that time, and still, one being, interestingly, the monk seal, the Mediterranean monk seal, another being sea turtles. And so the Commission did provide some funding for monk seal conservation, and it's again an interesting example of seals being singled out for protection in a very specific way. So, what can be done? What can the interested member of the public like you or I do to drive the conservation story and to help grey seals and other iconic species and habitats? We can get onto our MEPs, our members of the European Parliament. We can get onto our national parliamentarians. We can, sign any petitions that are bound to be coming out in the next few months and years, calling for the continued existence of these powerful conservation instruments and saying, look, we want these instruments to exist. They protect our most threatened wildlife and wild areas, and absolutely they must not be downgraded or renegotiated or weakened as a sop to the British Tory party or to Eurosceptics elsewhere.
I think Wicklow is a fantastic place that it's just not known, how nice it is down here, and you're on the water and you've got Sammy here 3 times a day, and we have some fantastic seafood around our coasts that thankfully we've got really good boats landing to us. Actually, when I'm leaving at the evening time, if he's still in and I'm walking down to the van, he'll follow me down.
Any objects, you were telling me, if you're paying too much attention to others? And
I was standing talking to a girl here one day with the bucket in my hand, and he splashed the water and drowned the 2 of us. So he's letting me know he wanted to be fed.
What would your wishes for his future be?
Oh, that he'd have a family and bring them all to meet me. The fishing industry here is not what it used to be. There's no gill netting or anything like that. So he's not affecting any of the fishermen. So they're all pot fishermen. They don't seem to go near the pots.
Does it help your business, or?
He's helped it immensely. Like, we've been mentioned all over national radio, and Ray Darcy, and he's been fantastic for business. It's bringing people down the quay, which it's a beautiful place. It's a lovely setting, and we really need to use it more. And he's been a big attractant, even for kids from local schools coming down on busloads to see him. He actually got up on the footpath and come across to the fish shop, right? And I was worried he might have got hit by a car. So I brought a bucket of fish across, and every time I throw a bit of fish in, he'd take the fish, get back in the water, take the fish, but get back out again. So the next morning we had a high tide again, and he got up on the footpath, but we didn't feed him, and he didn't come across. He didn't see the bucket, he didn't come across to the fish shop, so he just waited there till the tide dropped and he went back in.
It's a very respectful relationship you have, Alan, where both animal and yourself seem to know the boundaries. It's something other people should try to replicate.
Absolutely, like we have people coming into the shop all the time asking to feed him. We had people asking could they pet him when he was up on the road. You really have to respect that he's a wild animal. You wouldn't put your hand into a lion's cage.
Oh.
You know. So I would just ask people to enjoy him, and we'll stick to the feeding times that he's in the morning, in at lunchtime and in the evening time, and we'll certainly keep feeding him, but not so much that he won't fend for himself.
There's a huge amount of attention for dolphins, marine turtles, and other well-known species. You know, do these have the seals? Would you find them every bit as attractive?
Absolutely, he's great. If you see that water clear there, when he's going after a piece of fish, he's just so graceful, you know, and so intelligent. Like if I throw a bit of fish and the gulls come down to get it, he'll speed up to get to the fish first, or he'll sit in the middle of the river, so that when I throw the fish, he doesn't have far to go to get it before the gulls get it. But yeah, it's amazing. The kids, I mean, I wish I knew a bit more about him, and maybe you can get me some information on him that we can let the kids know and let the adults know, you know, how really intelligent these creatures are.
Well, we're learning, and actually I saw some recent documentation where they are probably rated 4th or 5th most intelligent species in the world. They're up there with the chimpanzees and the dolphins and all, and I think your stories bear it out. So we've a lot to learn.
Well, Patrick Wallock is my name, and I'm a lecturer in veterinary surgery in the University of Glasgow at the moment. But my interest in marine mammals, I suppose, goes back to sort of a childhood in Argyll in the west of Scotland, where there were a huge number of, I suppose, grey and common seals. And I got involved after my veterinary degree in wildlife rehabilitation and a bit of work with seals, and then came to Ireland and was adopted by the Irish Seal Sanctuary, I suppose, for want of a better way of putting it, and got sort of deeply involved in some early kind of veterinary work and veterinary surgery on marine mammals. We were really just looking at the different types of injuries and pathology that we were seeing in rehabilitated, rescued young seals that came from the coastline of Ireland, and in fact further afield sometimes. And a lot of it was just post-mortems of animals that died or were presented dead, and so there was a great database sort of built up of that, which probably informed some of the early treatments then. And then we started to get into wounds, animals with eye problems, and we probably got adventurous, for want of another way of putting it, and we were able to perform some of probably the first surgical procedures that had ever really been performed on marine mammals around these islands. And the first one, the one that springs to mind, was a grey seal with a very severe infection and osteomyelitis in its one of its flippers. And we just didn't really know whether we could anaesthetize this animal and also deal with this pretty severe infection. So we did a partial amputation, and I was involved in that with a former colleague, Martin Weaver, who sadly is no longer with us. But it was a great success, and the animal was rehabilitated, put on weight, and there was a great fanfare when it came time to release. And I suppose for me, one of the sort of great things about the background to the work that was done here in Ireland is that there was following of these animals. There were either local reports or people spent time to see whether we didn't really know whether it was worthwhile rehabilitating these animals. We didn't know, did 25% survive, 10% survive, none survive. But in fact, we got data on that, and we were then able to present that nationally and internationally, and even publish some of that work, which I think for me the idea of wildlife rehabilitation has got to be backed up by evidence, evidence-based, conservation. That's the future, really. So one of the, I suppose, most interesting things is the range of pathology that we, associated with these rehabilitated seals. Eye injuries, very common, with these big, frontally positioned eyes, which are very subject to trauma and injury, but also infections, probably secondary to wounds, things like osteomyelitis, which is an infection in the bone where the bacteria get down into the joint or into the bone itself, usually secondary to a wound, and then start to cause destruction and death, necrosis of the bone. And really the only way to deal with that is to actually go in and remove the infected bone in its entirety. And as I said, we didn't really know whether you could do that and expect an animal to survive in the wild, but fortunately we found out that yes, you could, and we were able to follow some of these animals. There was some tracking done, and that provided some evidence, and I'd like to think a platform for others, and since then a lot more work has been performed by our colleagues in UCD on the back of the original post-mortem work and then the surgery work. So it's very positive. I think it's a great legacy. I think it's fair to say that the grey seal has a big part in sort of Scottish culture and mythology, and I think you've got to remember that although for us in Scotland the grey seal is actually quite a common marine mammal, you can expect to see them around Scotland's coastline. It's actually in the world quite a rare animal. There aren't that many grey seals around, and I think, as I understand it, we have about 40% of the population of in the world around the Scottish coastline, which is fantastic. And I think if you look at Scottish poetry and story and myth and legend, the grey seal and the seal man, the Selkie in the Western Isles and the Hebrides is a great part of. I would, as a child, would have sung songs and been told stories about that kind of thing, and I think probably there is a love for the animal to some extent. I suppose in 1914, there was no legislative body in Scotland. It was Westminster. It was we were completely I suppose controlled from London, so it was probably brave Scottish MPs, of which there weren't very many, who decided that they were going to push for this act to preserve to look after the grey seal. I think they had maybe not altogether noble ideas in mind. They wanted to be able to shoot these animals, and it seemed like a good idea to preserve their numbers during the breeding season. But could you say that the grey seal was a talisman for conservation? Because it's been a great success. Grey seal numbers are at a record high. I think they're over potentially at 150,000 animals, perhaps even more. From an estimated low of, they reckon between 500 and 1,000, didn't they, in 1914? I don't think the numbers were probably very, critically assessed, but I think it was an altogether positive move and a conservation success. The world of veterinary medicine and biology has come together, and we've got a myriad of people who have great experience, great interest, and they're driving conservation forwards. And my ambition, I suppose, for the future is that that'll continue and grow, and we'll have this a world view of conservation which is a positive one.
Well, I was very lucky to have my dad George. He was always bringing us out in the outdoors, whether it was hunting or shooting or taking photographs or going for a walk in the woods. He was big into nature and fishing and shooting and everything. And one summer we were up there, and one day we were out, a lovely sunny day out in the bay, and we heard this shooting in the distance, and it was a group of German tourists that were being led by a semi-local German guide, and he was bringing groups of German hunters out, and they were shooting the seals, and then stuck meat hooks in them and towed them ashore onto a little spit just off Ballyvaughan. They pulled the carcasses up onto the beach, and they skinned the carcasses on the beach and left the seals to rot on the beach for all to see. And Da went in the evening, that's where he went off to. He was taking photographs of the carcasses left on the beach and sent them into the Times and sent them to well-known nature people at the time like Gerd van Gelderen and Liam de Boteler. And the story and some of the photographs were printed in the Irish Times, and that was one of the things which helped the legislation that protected seals. I think that was around the early 70s sometimes. The legislation, that helped the legislation come true that protected the seals. So on the boat, when we have the visitors, it's a little bit difficult. They think they're going out on to the zoo, for example, and that they're paying for a product, and they think, right, well, we have a right more or less to do as we please here. So we have to really explain to them that we're the visitors today, and that we're going out and we're visiting the seals in their home, their natural environment. And while we have every right to observe the wildlife, we have to respect the fact that this is their home. And if we want to get close to them and to get into their heads and experience their real existence, we've got to pretend like we're not there. We've got to disappear. And the best way to disappear is just to be absolutely still and quiet and silent, and let the seals do their thing. And I suppose sometimes it's difficult. Sometimes people don't want to sit still, or they feel like that they're being sort of pressurized into being still. But after a while, when they realize that if they stay still, that these gorgeous creatures will actually come up, they'll be just as interested in looking at them as they are in looking at the seals. So sometimes it's a bit of a job getting people to sit very still and respect the fact that we must respect the seals and their space. But when they do settle down and be quiet, then fantastic things can happen. The island of Mull off the west coast of Scotland, white-tailed sea eagle watching alone is worth something like 5 million sterling to the small island of Mull, where there's something like 20 B&Bs and 3 hotels. So that's a huge amount of employment just from eagle watching. And I suppose eagles are very spectacular. Eagle is sort of the symbol of America, the bald-headed eagle or so on. The white-tailed eagle is a very similar bird, and they're coming here, so we hopefully will get a big industry from it, and people will get great enjoyment going on eagle watching boat trips and so on. And the seals are equally beautiful and gorgeous. I mean, today now we were watching how many 15, 20 seals we saw with their little baby pups and feeding on the rocks and hanging onto the mother's necks and rubbing noses. I mean, it was a seriously emotive subject for people. I mean, I've had people coming up to me on the boat and tears in their eyes, saying they had such an amazing experience seeing these beautiful animals that they'd only ever see maybe on David Attenborough, on the Blue Planet. So having the seals here and all around our coast, a lot of places they're not valued. We should be using the seals a lot more in giving value to our natural environment and in increasing the income from visitors. I mean, it sounds a bit commercial in a way, but it's adding value to the local environment and the wildlife and so on. I suppose, I suppose the dolphins and the whales take all the big attention because they look so spectacular. Whether it's a whale broaching or dolphins porpoising or whatever. But I mean, if you were to talk to the people on safari after they've been eye to eye and face to face with a little seal pup that's just been born that morning, or in fact even sometimes they might have seen the seal pup being born, well, I think that's as special as any whale brooch you'd ever see, or any dive that you see an eagle making and picking a fish off the surface. The seals are just gorgeous, gorgeous animals. And the big thing about them, they're a lot more accessible. You won't see, people often ask me, will we see whales today or will we see dolphins? And I say, no, we don't see whales that often, maybe once a year or twice a year, or dolphins 2 or 3 times a year. But you'll see gorgeous wildlife, gorgeous seals. And they say, oh great, so they come on down, they think no more about it. And after the seal watching experience, they come to me and they say, that was amazing. That was, life-changing. That was changed their whole perspective on the seals and so on. So never realizing they could be so gorgeous and cute. So we have to appreciate the seals a lot more. They're there, and we can create employment from jobs from it. Seal watching is a realistic job creating industry, and it should be nurtured, and we should be putting a lot more resources into it.
My grandfather came in here, sold fish. He was a trawler man from Fleetwood, and he met my granny. She lived on the road there. And her mother was selling fish. That was my great granny selling fish. They all sold fish on the pier.
And I wonder, would they have shared their fish with the seals in those days?
I don't know where the seals around then, you see.
They were probably shyer.
They probably didn't come around. Now they just come there every day because they know they're going to be fed, and they're not shy.
Yeah. And would you tell, when did you start feeding them?
Oh God, about probably 15 years ago. Outside they just start throwing the fish out. So every day they just come. Some days it could be 7, 5, 2. Another time they might go missing for about an hour or 2, but then they come back. So I think they're over in Bulk Harbour. Oh, they know where to go for the fish, yeah. And I can feed them at the steps in the morning. Oh yeah, we're very fond of them. Like your dogs, like sea dogs, exactly,
The Coonamarras, the hounds of the sea.
Oh,
That's,
well, all the kids have names for them. They love mackerel, they love salmon, oily fish, heron. Did you get heron? We like the big one, Sammy. We all like Sammy. All the kids like Sammy as well. And Arthur's the next one. The kids all have their own name for them, but we call them Sammy and Arthur.
Yeah. And those two are coming a long time, are they?
A long time, yeah. And then the new babies arrive. So I think there's about 7 now.
Yeah, that's wonderful.
Yeah, about 7. Well, as long as we're here, Sammy was there about 15 years, I'd say. I don't know how long he's been around, but that's how long I know.
And they're compatible with the business. Do they actually do this?
They would draw people because they all bring their kids down. And they're coming for the fish, they all bring the kids down. And then all the sailing clubs all stand along and feed the fish as well. You know? Yeah. Just when they start coming at first, then I think they were very shy. They used to stay in the middle. There have a few people come down in wheelchairs even, and the man just lives at the Rodney Park side and sits there and he has a sandwich and a cup of tea and all. I'd miss them if they weren't there now. Because even if they're not, if we look out, we don't see them. I said, where's the seals today? We do go around the back looking for them. Yeah, they're brilliant.
I'm Sean McKeown, Director of Photo Wildlife Park, and in the background we have a harbour seal called Elvis. Now, Elvis is nearly a 30-year-old female. She came into the park in 1984, beginning of 85, and she's been here ever since. She used to be free range in the lake. Now she shares her enclosure with the white-tailed sea eagles, and they get on perfectly. Nature usually gets on well with itself. It's the humans that cause the difficulty for nature. We used to have quite a few sea eagles around Ireland, became extinct. There's been a reintroduction program, and it's just to make people aware of how big and how graceful these birds are. The same with the seal. A lot of people, probably particularly the landlovers, don't see seals. They rarely are at the coastline. They don't really know what seals do or what they're about. Even within our harbours, we see very few of them. Numbers are, not very good at the moment. So we're losing our wildlife, and it's a way of showing people who don't normally go out or living in urban areas what is around us in terms of our native biodiversity. Wildlife throughout the world is decreasing for very many species. For instance, amphibians, frogs, there's over 700 species of frog that are endangered or critically endangered. Some are even already extinct that we didn't even know existed. That's how much how little we know about our global wildlife. Lucky enough, we're beginning to understand about it a little bit more, and zoos and wildlife parks throughout the world, and a lot of local enthusiasts are getting involved in breeding these species in captivity, trying to reintroduce them. We've lost the corn-bunting recently. We have corncrakes dying out, and if we don't do something really radical and change how we live, how we approach nature, we're going to lose it all.
the nature of this world. We're losing a piece of a jigsaw puzzle. And eventually, if you pull all that away, you're left with nothing. And we are independent. We are at the center of that. And if you take it all away, we disappear basically as well. We have to realize that. There are simple ways that we can change our lifestyles, use less energy, become more aware of how we dispose of our waste products, etc. The population of the world, the other thing is, the population of the world is increasing and will increase over the next 50 years. And that will actually put a lot more pressure on wildlife. Basically, if you take it, we are living well beyond our means in the Western world. We would need the equivalent of three Earths to populate the existing population. Never mind what it's supposed to grow by another 3 billion by 2050. So that has a huge effect and pressure on the natural world, and we have to start to take it into consideration. Now, there are good things that we've changed around. We've saved a number of species from extinction. We have created a number of national parks, areas where wildlife can coexist with people, but it's not enough, and we're still using forests in Asia, in South America, which are important for the well-being of our planet. The climate is changing, there's no doubt about that. Even our life in Ireland will change dramatically. We're going to have much stormier winters. That's what's predicted, and we're beginning to see that. As the temperature of the oceans warm up, there's a lot more energy there, and that builds up in storms, hits our coastlines, and we get damage from it. We can change little things. We can, whether it's using less water, electricity, turning off devices, unplugging devices, and even what the consumer as an individual, if they're a bit more caring. For instance, there is palm oil, an effort to stop palm oil production, and the reason for that is that in large parts of Asia they are destroying forests to grow palm oil, and that is used in all sorts of products, from food products, from bars that we eat, ice cream that we eat, and if we become a bit more discriminating and refuse to eat these, then we as consumers can change things, and we have to look at those ideas for the future. Do little things, make a big difference.
I lecture here in Irish folklore, and I've been here for quite a few years now, more than I care to specify at this stage. But in any case, Irish folklore is a subject that you can study here in UCD as part of the BA programme, and what it focuses on are the I suppose you could say the history that never got into the history books, which is how folklore has been defined at times. It's the unwritten traditions and beliefs and customs and practices of the ordinary people. It's the kind of material that very often it kind of falls under the radar, I suppose you could say, when it comes to the official historical record. But we who work in Irish folklore would believe that this kind of material is hugely important for a whole number of reasons. First of all, in terms of finding out more about ourselves and how we think and why we act and behave the way we do. And also because an awful lot of this material has a huge intrinsic beauty and an artistic merit and value of its own, which we believe is also worthy of study and worthy of research. There would be a huge amount of information on seals and traditions about seals in the archives here in the National Folklore Collection. There would be literally hundreds of stories and anecdotes about seals and their behaviour and beliefs about seals, supernatural beliefs about seals and so on. And these would come from many parts of the country, I suppose primarily from the west coast, simply because most of the folklore collecting was done along the west coast as opposed to the east coast. But they are very widely distributed geographically, and you find stories like this in both Irish and in English. There's quite a complex relationship traditionally between people, coastal communities and seals going back many hundreds of years, and there's a certain kind of an ambiguity attaching to that relationship as well. On the one hand, seals were certainly hunted to a certain extent by various coastal communities, and they were hunted for their oil, sometimes for their meat, sometimes for their skin in order to make waistcoats and various other articles of clothing from their skin. But as well as that, there was a very, very strong undercurrent of belief in many parts of the country in the supernatural nature of seals. And there was a widespread feeling that there was something about seals that wasn't quite natural, I suppose, or that they were partly enchanted, they were partly human. So as I say, you do have this fascinating kind of an ambiguity in terms of coastal communities' relationship with seals. The reason for these beliefs springing up about seals are kind of easy enough to follow and to understand, I think, in some ways, because seals can be quite human-like in their behaviour at times. And there are a whole lot of lovely anecdotes recorded from various parts of the country which have descriptions of things like seals behaving with their young in a way that seems to mirror very closely, you know, human adults trying to control their young and trying to kind of give them a slap if they misbehave or whatever it might be. And there are accounts of that kind. There are also accounts indeed from the Northwest Mayo area of seals actually succouring and looking after human children who have become lost and so on. In a sense, it's really missing the point in one way to try to establish whether or not stories like this are actually historically accurate. Instead, what they do give us is a very, very graphic insight into people's perception of seals and the way in which they regarded seals, which, as I said, has a subtlety all of its own. There are quite a number of stories, for example, about seals who have the ability to speak with the power of human speech. And there are many accounts of people who would have been killing seals, trying to hunt seals in the past. And there are several stories about seal hunters who would be on the point of drawing their club or their stick to strike a seal, and then the seal would speak very often in Irish, sometimes in English, to the seal hunter and say, "Oh, hold your hand and don't strike me. Don't you know that I am of your own flesh and blood?" Or something equally, I suppose, startling and chilling, which would take anybody aback, and thus obviously save themselves from being killed. But there are many other versions of stories about seals who speak, which are, I suppose, somewhat less dramatic. There's a story I remember recording myself from a wonderful woman called Mrs. Teresa McHale in Northwest Mayo many years ago. And this is a version of a story that you find in many parts of the country, whereby a man finds a seal, a young seal, stranded on the beach one day and brings the seal back to his house that night, just intending to look after it, or maybe not too sure what he's going to do with it, I suppose. But during the night, a number of seals gather outside the house and start calling for Donecha or for Thaig. Sometimes these were two names that were particularly associated with seals, saying, "Oh, where is Donecha? Where is Donecha? Where are you? What has happened to you?" At which point the man, understandably, and certainly in the version of the story that I recorded from Mrs. McHale near Killala in County Mayo, the man immediately takes the young seal and leaves the seal back on the beach again, because clearly the people of the seal are looking for the seal. There are stories about men who actually married enchanted seal women who appeared as seals much of the time, but who were capable of taking human form as well. And the general gist of this story seems to imply that there is a garment of some kind which the woman would need to wear when she was assuming her seal form, and which she would need to go back into the sea. And the man in this case succeeds in stealing this garment from her, and because she hasn't got the garment, she can't go back into the sea, so she has to follow the man home, and they end up, in most versions of the story, getting married and having a family and so on. But one day, by chance, the man, or the woman rather, discovers the garment that the man has stolen from her, and which he has hidden away in the loft of the house, or sometimes in an outhouse and so on. And on discovering this garment, she immediately seizes it and disappears back into the sea again, never to be seen anymore. Sometimes it's said she brings her children with her, and sometimes it's said that she leaves them on land behind her. Fairy tales or whatever, which belong to a past which is now irrelevant, I think quite the opposite is the case. And I think that we really have an awful lot to learn if we let ourselves do that from material like this, which can be of huge use today in terms of our attitude to endangered species and the environment in general.
This company's in operation since 1970, but I think there was boats here going back to the start of about 1930 or 40, the start here. I can remember seals as a kid, which would bring us back to the early 60s. Just remember the seals, they were always they were a great attraction here in Glengarriff, obviously. Even as kids, we were fascinated by them because they were the closest thing we saw to dogs. So they were big attraction. In the early part of the year, when the season starts, March, April time, for the first few weeks you can't get that close to them with the boats, but then they just don't take any notice after that. Back in 2002, I know one morning I counted almost 300. I'm sure there's at least that many there now, probably more. Yeah, I mean, long before I ever even got involved in this job, they were protected by the local tourist board, I suppose, anybody involved in tourism, in particular the boatmen. The fishermen mightn't be of the same bracket, but the fishermen don't harm them here, like they've never been touched.
And were they to be threatened, how would the ferrymen feel about it?
Oh, I think we'd have to put a stop to that straight away. I mean, they are a major attraction for Glengarriff. It's one of the few areas in the country when you can actually go on a boat, within 5 or 10 minutes off the shore, you can see 100 seals, maybe 150 seals at one time. I don't think anybody would harm them anyway because, as I say, they're well protected. Everybody in this area sort of looks after them. Yeah. And no, I think they're quite safe here. That's a new addition to the area, the Eagle. It's a major attraction, the amount of people that come to see it. So, yeah, I think the like of that is great for the area. It proves what a good, healthy area it is to live in. And I think, it's a big tourist attraction as well as good for the locals as well. I suppose the one thing they've meant to us is they've enhanced our business of people going to Garnish Island. The seals are another attraction en route to Garnish Island. And in fact, for some people, the seals are a primary attraction. That's just the one thing, I suppose. And the fact they don't do any harm to anybody, I think they're very good in the area. In fact, people shout, they scream. It's hard to believe it. We just take these things for granted. I mean, I've seen seals since I was a child, but some people have never seen seals. And to be that close to them, it is a nice thing to see, certainly.
Yeah, so my name is Dave Reid. I have a long, cumbersome title, Principal Investigator in Ecosystem Approach to Fisheries Management. So that's really about fisheries and the ecosystem, both effective one and the other. And one aspect of that, of course, is the fishery relationship with seals. In terms of citizen science, there's a lot that citizens can do. It's observations of animals in the environment. So things like seabirds, seals, even dolphins, individual spottings of those by the public reported to groups like the Seal Sanctuary give us more information that we can go on. The stranding information is always very useful to us because we can't go out and monitor everything all the time. So the citizen has a role in all this sort of stuff. One of the things we're working on at the moment is not to do with seals, but it's to do with skates and rays and sharks, and information from the public on where their egg sacs wash up on the shore is proving quite useful in understanding where those populations are. So it's that type of almost observational stuff, but where you have 1 million people doing it, you start to generate some power. The job's about trying to find a way of carrying out sustainable fisheries. So it's like sustainable both in terms of the fish stocks, which is classic fisheries management, and sustainable in terms of impacts on the environment. So what the fishery does to the rest of the environment. So other fish stocks, the sea floor, and things like seals, cetaceans, seabirds, etc. The seal populations interact with the fish population, so they feed, that's their principal source of food. And so that's of course where the interaction with the fishery comes in, because the fishermen are after some of the fish in the sea and the seals are after some of the fish in the sea. And of course sometimes the fishermen find the seals taking what they regard as their fish. Of course the seals regard them as their fish. What I was looking for was I was actually looking for something where the interaction was direct, close, and important. Where there was an interaction between fishermen or the fisheries and component of the ecosystem, where you could actually start to get some hard numbers on what was going on, and where there was a key need to develop a more, how shall we say it, a more scientific, hard number-based understanding of how that interaction was working. And seals were definitely a good candidate, and we have some very good seal scientists in Ireland that I was lucky enough to be able to work with, so that was why we headed down that particular road. So when you look at an ecosystem, it's all the components in it. It's all the living components and the non-living components. So In the case of the marine environment, which is my speciality, you're looking at everything from whales down to the smallest plankton. Classically, you're either eaten or eat everything else in the ocean. And that's the food web interaction. And that's really a lot of what the ecosystem's about, is how all the organisms interact in that, and then how we interact with that. And because everything is either eaten by or eats everything else in some way or other, then one of the things with seals, to come back to seals, is that they're at the top of that. They're the last group that eat something. There's very little that eats seals thereafter. So they are what we call top or apex predators, which makes them very useful organisms to understand in the context. If the system's healthy, it can support a good seal population. So that's what we're after, healthy but sustainable systems, but that we can exploit with fisheries. So I'm not about managing ecosystems, we're about managing human impacts on ecosystems. Okay, I'm not an expert on population censuses, but yeah, the recent census of the seals, but the grey seals and common seals in Ireland, has shown that the populations are doing fine. Certainly not declining, probably expanding in most places. So that's a pretty good sign. The populations are low compared to the populations I'm used to in Scotland, maybe a tenth of what we used to have in Scotland. So yeah, the populations are doing fine. And what I've been working on is some of the threats and interactions of that population with the fisheries. So some of the threats to that are bycatch in fisheries, I guess, which is... So the bycatch here is the accidental capture of individual seals in a net. And here we're talking about set nets. These are nets that are put out and left by the fishermen. And so the seal can get caught up in those and of course then can drown as a result. So that's what we would call bycatch, accidental capture of the seal in a fishing net. And so some of these fisheries are causing bycatch effects, and that's a concern. But at the same time, the bycatch is not sufficient to endanger the population, which is the good news about the thing. The seals are obviously coming to the nets for more than just accidental purposes. They're coming to feed off the fish that are in the nets. And that, of course, upsets fishermen a lot. The big outstanding species that's struck is monkfish, which a lot of the fishermen find when they pull up the nets, the monkfish have been half eaten by the seal. And of course, understandably, that upsets the fishermen quite a lot. At the same time, because the seals are coming to the nets, presumably to take those fish, they're also exposing themselves to the risk of these accidental bycatch, accidental being tangled in the nets. So the two things have to be studied together, and you have to understand both things together, and then try and, what we're hoping to do is start then devising or building approaches that reduce both that, it's called depredation, the removal of fish from the net by seals, and the bycatch of seals in the net. So a lot of my job is to try and bring in funding to allow us to continue to do research. And the study I talked about earlier on the seals taking fish out of the nets and the seals getting caught in the nets threw up quite a lot of interesting stuff that we can then take forward. So we showed that there could well be ways of reducing the chances of the seals getting caught in the nets. There could be ways the fishermen work that would reduce the chances of seals taking fish out of the nets. And that's the sort of area we'd like to move on to. So we've identified, at least in part, that there's a problem, and now we want to try and identify ways of maybe not eliminating that problem, but reducing it. So fewer dead seals caught in nets and fewer fish that have been eaten before they can get to market, and perhaps take some tension out of the whole system. We also would like to continue research on looking at the way those two components, the fishermen and the seals, interact more widely in the ocean. You know, how the food that each of them takes out of the ocean, how that food is a competition between them or not a competition between them. Okay, so the studies I've described here were research studies, doing science, trying to find out what's going on. And what we'd really like to do is then develop the understandings we got there and take that forward to try and find solutions to the problems of these interactions, where it affects both the seals in terms of bycatch and it affects the fishermen in terms of lost catches, lost livelihood.
neither fully creatures of land or of the sea. Instead, they straddle the two, and they belong to this kind of in-between world, I suppose, in that they are both creatures of land and creatures of the sea. And such liminal entities or kind of marginal bodies very, very often do attract all kinds of beliefs and associated narratives in popular tradition, and seals are a really good example of that. It's the fact that they are neither one thing or the other. So we're dealing with something which is a near universal in terms of human culture and human storytelling.
Apart from our love of wildlife, it's our business and it's probably the future. A lot of people, you know, who have given up the fishing have turning to the type of thing we're doing, and I think it's going to become more and more in the future. But you have to protect those habitats and ecosystems. You're not going to have that in the future.
We have to appreciate the seals a lot more. They're there, and we can create employment from it, from jobs from it. Seal watching is a realistic job creating industry, and it should be nurtured, and we should be putting a lot more resources into it.
We as consumers can change things. We must learn more about the damage to us that we're doing, the benefits that it'll bring, and we have to be willing enough to go that little bit extra mile, and it's up to every individual. You're not going to get laws and regulations and things saying that you have to do that, because it just won't happen. We have to take responsibility ourselves, do it ourselves, otherwise things are not going to change.
Not about managing ecosystems, we're about managing human impacts on ecosystems.
The seals are another attraction en route to Garnish Island, and in fact for some people the seals are a primary attraction. That's just the one thing, I suppose, and the fact they don't do any harm to anybody, I think they're very good in the area.
If we could only get people as interested in the seals as they're interested in the dolphins and the whales, then we might get someplace.
We're good in law now, but we aren't so good on protection.
Seals are, in a way, there's a love-hate relationship there, you know, for all sorts of reasons. You know, there are people who would, you know, see a photograph of a seal and or see a seal pup maybe on a wildlife tour or something, and virtually fall in love with it and want to do everything to protect that. There are other people obviously who come into conflict with them, and they're wild animals, just like, you know, foxes or deer or all sorts of other animals that live around human beings. So I think in terms of opportunities for the future arising out of seals, I would say yes, but I think they have to be understood as well as being another wild animal. Certainly as a scientist, that's where I see my role. You know, is to concentrate on the facts and on the evidence and try and help guide the management and the conservation forward based on what's known, and where there are things that aren't known, then that's obviously where you put some resources to try and understand better.
I just seen this one seal in particular, one of me trips, following me around the whole trip and watching me pulling the cod end strings as the net came into the boat. And he was watching me every shot. I'd pull the strings, I'd grab the strings and pull them. And the last day of the trip, on my last shot, we were lifting the cod end over the side of the boat. And with that, the seal had pulled on the two cod end strings and opened the whole catch on top of himself in the water. And all I could do was just look and say, I'm going to have to tie a different knot in that. So I decided, it was better to tie a different knot in it, that the seals were starting to get very clever. He watched me every shot. I made about 12 shots in that trip, and he watched me every time till the last shot, and he pulled them strings, and that was my whole catch gone. And all I could do was laugh, and the crew were all laughing as well, because we couldn't believe what we just witnessed. It was very funny.
There are seals all around our coast, and they like the sun. They'll bask in the sun. You'll see them on the rocks off here. You'll see them on the end of Dollymount Beach sometimes now. There's quite a colony of them there. So when you come across a seal, even a pup, it's not necessarily in trouble. It could be just kind of lying in the sun enjoying itself. It could be there waiting for its mother to come and suckle it. So the thing to do is not to rush in and try and help the seal. It's to stand back and observe. And if you observe over a while, I mean, a seal could be there for a number of hours. So if you were out for a walk and you saw a seal, you thought it was in trouble, look at it, wait, go off, have your walk, come back. If the seal is still there and you think it's in trouble, don't go near it, call the authorities. That's the best thing to do, because as I said before, they are a wild animal and there is an appropriate way to approach them and to handle them, and it's only for the experts to do that.
Sports shooters who were shooting grey seal, the impetus to think twice and think about the bigger picture. And like many people, those hunters, and that's happened in other countries as well, have turned from helping to shoot game or big game in the case of Africa and gone over to shooting it with a camera rather than with a rifle. We've managed to keep them safe for 100 years now. They've rebuilt their populations, but if they're going to see it into any great distance in the future, climate change is the big question that we all have to tackle as a group. Most people's experience of the sea is the very edge and the very thin, shallow parts of the sea. And the sea is enormous and it's deep and it's much bigger than the land, and in places like Ireland our sea responsibility is a multiple of our land area. And it's important for people to realise that you may not necessarily get close to these things, but they're just as important as part of the ecology. And you will see seals bobbing their heads, staring at you through the seaweed. Take your time, stay quiet and get close as you can. You're not necessarily going to interfere with their day, but they might give you the inspiration to see that there's more out there than you noticed before.